Good morning, everyone. I'm Polly. This is Fanny.
Morning.
Welcome to this morning session. Um, in this session today, we will be focusing on the job cost report. That feature we quietly released a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah.
um, just like that. And we thought it's a good idea to explain it after a couple of weeks of release. And yeah, we think you guys have some questions about that. So today we will be focusing on the JCR and why we've released JCR
Yeah.
and why is it important? What
Yeah.
does it do? And then we will go through all the steps of the JCR, all the different parts, and explain them in detail. Hope it works for you.
Yeah. Should be good. Something like a JCR, which is number heavy, can be easier to understand when it's explained to you, as opposed to just reading the words on the screen, because there are articles about the JCR. A lot of the terminology is pretty wordy, just because you kind of need to get to the crux of and be pretty precise about what you're saying. But hopefully today we can kind of pair what those mean with what they actually mean for your business. So
For sure.
hopefully we can get some value behind a lot of that. And yeah, just make sure that you guys are across everything that's in the JCR, and actually using it, which is really cool.
Yeah. I feel like lots of people have been asking me in the past about um, being able to generate a job cost report and understand the job performance in at every stage of the project, I
Yeah.
guess. So that's why we kind of thought of it
Totally.
and we released it to help you understand the
Totally.
performance of your business.
And there are some new things that we have added, some new terms that we've added just to JCR at the moment. They'll probably make their way into other areas of the product in the future, but we've just introduced some new figures to help people at the start of jobs set those jobs up in a way that will be profitable for them. So essentially, using things like an estimated cost amount or an estimated profit margin. These are things that we've introduced, and we'll talk through today, explain how they work, how they calculated, and what they mean for you, so that you can actually use those as a guide when you're planning out those jobs.
Yeah.
But before we do dive into the JCR,
Good job.
let's do some
Housekeeping.
Yeah.
Cool. I can explain.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you guys feel free to say hi and say where you come from, say hello. And if you have any questions, just feel free to just send them through. We will go through them at the end because we've got quite a lot to cover, a lot of information, a lot of numbers.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
have your notepads ready.
Keep you in the zone, and we'll talk about questions at the
Yeah.
end so we can unpack those to keep everything on track.
For sure. And I'm sure there will be a few questions and suggestions, so which is always good to know.
Totally.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
Yeah. So do introduce yourself, say g'day. And without further ado, I'm gonna open up. Before we do kind of look at the JCR itself, I'm gonna open up Streamtime so we can just look at how it's created, how we generate a JCR. If you haven't already worked that out, just so you guys are clear of where this is being accessed from and coming from. Cool.
Yeah. Cool.
So
And first of all, let's just touch base on what JCR is
Yeah.
really. What
Great
does it
idea.
do? Well, basically, it will be able to provide insight on your job performance at any stage of your project. So we will estimate your project profitability and we look at the actual profitability as well on the JCR. So we'll present with the JCR presents with a detailed breakdown of all the aspects within the job. And you can always see how the job is tracking. So you can download multiple JCRs at any stage of the project to understand whether this job progressed and how.
Certainly, we'd certainly encourage you to do that, especially at that initial planning phase, as we mentioned just now, that we have added some new terms and figures in each of the JCR around estimation of the cost of a project and its profitability. So those are specifically designed to help you plan your jobs. So being aware of those is great, and obviously as it's running, you want to see where things are at, and then they're great at the end to kind of retrospectively look back and see how they're going or how they performed, I suppose. And when we're talking about JCRs, they live against jobs. So each job will have its own JCR, and it's isolated. And the people that are probably most interested in looking at those are going to be business owners or the managers of those jobs. potentially finance managers too, to understand exactly, or to get a breakdown, I suppose, of everything that kind of went into that job, looking at those total costs. But it is more the people who will be in charge of running the projects and controlling those costs and understanding where things are going and how profitable they will be, so that they can make good business decisions. It will be accessing those reports.
For sure. And it's a very good looking document as well, thanks to our design team. So you can download it as PDF and
print it out. You can
print it,
frame it. Yeah.
Yeah. And when it comes to actually creating a JCR,
Yeah.
When do you think it's best to start using that? At the beginning of the job?
Yeah.
Or okay.
I would suggest planning out a job initially, to gauge the scope. So starting to understand the different phases of the job, who might be working on it, and get some hours and rates in there. Any costs that are going to be coming through the job, add them too, so you can plan for them. And before you send that quote to the client, once you're happy with how that plan's looking, I would suggest generating a JCR to at least look at, based on the planned amounts, what is your estimated profit going to be, or your estimated costs, so you can understand if the amount that you're planning to sell it for is going to be substantial enough.
For sure. And once you kind of start tracking time and adding more stuff into a job, you can keep going and downloading that JCR and having a look at a glance on how your project is tracking as well.
Totally. So where is the JCR? How do I access it? How do I generate it? There are two places you can generate the JCR. As I said before, they're all related to the job. So the first one we can do from this list view, which is nice and easy. If you do want to, generate a bunch of JCRs for a list of jobs, you can filter this list to see those jobs together. Maybe it's all jobs that are due this month or something like that. And then at the end here, we've got your options button. The job cost report is just an option in here. So you can click that and download that one straight away. So you can easily just roll through this list, download your JCRs as you need them for different projects. And of course, within the job as well. So we've got our job here. When we come to our create button up the top here, we've got an option now for our JCR. So clicking that is going to download that report for us.
Awesome.
Cool. Now, let's take a look, shall we?
Let's do it.
Cool. I'm just going to change this window.
So before we go into detail on what JCR is and all the sections of that report, we will talk about the new terms that we introduced in Streamtime. Patty mentioned that you might see them in the future, and we might introduce them in other areas of Streamtime. So it's important you understand those terms and understand how we calculate them too.
Exactly.
So one of the first terms is we introduce the total estimated cost. So there are two different ways. So total estimated cost, it depends on how you plan your job, obviously. So total estimate of a job cost rate. So if your item planned by individual hourly rate,
by your team members?
Team members hourly rate, we look at your team members cost rate and multiply it by the time that you've planned out for that item. So if that item's hours are planned by an item, so it's got its own rate, we will look at the average cost rate and time planned for.
The average cost rate of all team members assigned to that item. Yeah. So if there are 3 team members assigned to an item, but you're planning the hours at the item level, and using an item hourly rate to sell it, we'll consider the average of those hours across each team member and take the average cost rate of those 3 team members as well, and generate that. So keeping in mind, this is just an estimate. It's not entirely accurate, especially if you are using that item level of planning. But it's the closest thing we can provide if you are only going to that level. And hopefully it is at least useful enough to give you a guide towards the potential cost of that project. The most accurate way to get that cost is if you do go very granular with your hour planning at each team member's level, and budget those hours specifically. But the reality is, it would be great if those team members did work those hours, but as we know, that's not always the case, and so that might be likely to shift.
Yeah.
So using that bucket might serve more use there. Using those hours at the item level. But again, good to just understand these things at this point when we're estimating. It is dangerous territory, to overpromise on what those costs might be. But so long as we can at least get somewhere, in a ballpark figure, which might help you guys plan your jobs accurately or efficiently.
Exactly. And when you've got an item where no team members assigned to them or no hours planned, we disregard those items in your JCR.
Yeah.
So it's important that you understand that.
So even if there is an item where you have maybe 20 hours of work planned, if there are no team members there, we're not able to generate a cost rate for that or an estimated cost rate for that because the cost rate is defined by the team member's hourly rate or hourly cost, which is set up against the team member. So without that information actually sitting on that item, there's not much we can do there. So we just, as you said, Polly, disregard it completely.
Yep. So we also introduced the estimated profit margin. So it's an estimated one. So it's important to understand that we take that figure from budget minus the total estimated cost. So this figure is obviously estimated, so it's not real. So, but then you will be able to compare the estimated profit margin with the current profit margin once the job starts progressing.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good one. And that budget, often the budget will be defined by an approved quote as well. So as the flow goes in Streamtime, once you plan a job, you will create a quote and then you'll send that to the client. And as soon as that quote's approved, we take that figure and we call that the budget from that point forward. And so in that instance, this is what you'll see here in this top left box. And so comparing that figure versus the total estimated cost will give you that estimated profit margin. So at the start there of the project, knowing that that's where we'll be looking towards in terms of, if you do internally have target margins that you look to set up on projects, knowing how to get that estimated profit margin and ensuring that you do have team members assigned to all those items to kind of, create that guide for a total estimated cost will be the most effective way to get a solid estimated profit margin. And without those things, that figure will not be as useful or as accurate as it could potentially be. So that's a good thing to be aware of too.
Yeah. And the last one is we introduced the profit margin versus budget. So this one is a tricky one. It took me a bit of time to understand, but I got it now. And it's really useful too, because the way we calculate it is we take the budget and minus total use cost at the time of the report generation. But this this profit margin is only realized if the budget invoiced now. So you can, every time you generate a JCR, the profit margin versus budget will change if you have something changed within the job. So you've got estimated profit margin, you've got profit margin versus budget, and you've got an actual profit margin. Those three you can compare and understand how your job is tracking anytime you generate a JCR.
Exactly. That was well said. And I think at the end of the day, the profit margin, this one that sits right at the top here, that is essentially at the end of the day what you'll be taking home as truth, because the profit margin, some of you may already know, and we do summarize these terms just at the bottom here. I'll draw an article into the sidebar here, so which contains definitions of all these terms, so you guys can go and reference these and make sure you understand them fully once the webinar is done. But that profit margin figure is the total invoiced amount of the project at the end, or at any point, I suppose, based on what's been invoiced, minus the total used cost. So it's the difference between the revenue that's coming in and the costs that are going out through, the time that was tracked to your team members, what you're paying them, and any time and any expenses and purchase orders. Sorry. So essentially, that's what's in your pocket at the end of the day. That profit margin is, how much. That's essentially how much profit do we make on this job, which is more than self-explanatory. But,
exactly.
That's that.
Yeah, cool. So it's important. There are 3 different profit margins, and 2 out of 3 are estimated, so they're not real. So as Patty said, looking at the profit margin, and the actual profit margin is to go to. This is your figure. This is your profit right now, and then real one.
Exactly. Cool. And we're gonna now just take a quick walk through this JCR. You can see it up on the screen there. We'll just explain the different components, how it's set up, and obviously, if you guys have any questions along the way, please drop them into that chat on the side, and we can come back to them at the end.
Cool.
But just summarizing, I suppose, this is your first page of the JCR. We've got a job name, the job number, the client. We've got our labels there. So if you do have labels on the project, they'll be sitting just there too under the job name. We've got the start date and the due date of the entire project. So it's the first date that we have set up and the last date. And then in the top right corner there, you've got today's date. So we've just generated that one this morning.
Yeah, I love the colors here, Patty. I mean, the guys at the back, they did a really good job. And we've got what was planned area, which is a bit grayed out. How it's tracking, it's your actual numbers and at a glance. So with a little, how you call them, pretty graphs.
Yes. Quick summaries,
At a glance.
which little bar graphs just showing you those figures together. But looking at what was planned on this job, so understanding that this is kind of divided in how we've planned the project and how it's actually tracking. So what's happening, or what is the status of that? It's more active. So looking at what was planned, we've got that budget there. Now you can set that budget up manually, or it could be the approved quote. The approved quote is definitely the strongest way to kind of get that budget, because then that figure won't move until either that quote changes or another quote is approved. So that is an oldie but a goodie. The total estimated cost, which is that new figure that we've just introduced. Again, just reminding you that one we're using based on the planned number of hours against either team members or team members on an item. We can only give you a total estimated cost where team members are allocated to an item or assigned to an item, and that figure will be more accurate if you're planning hours at the team member level as opposed to at the item level, just because when those hours are planned at the item level, we do average out the cost rates of the team members assigned. So depending on how granular you can get with that planning, you'll get different figures there.
Cool. And the total planned sell, we take it from the total sell rate from all items that planned out and expenses as well. So all items, they include post completed and in play items as well. So it's important to keep that in mind.
That is a good thing to add as well, actually, is that the total estimated cost does include the cost of any expenses or purchase orders added to the project too. It's not just time, but the time aspect of it is probably the most important to understand in terms of how it's calculated. Cool. So that estimated profit margin, we did touch on that one as well.
Budget minus total estimated cost. And the team members in the bottom. Very important. Yeah, pretty self-explanatory.
Nice to have a place for them though.
For sure.
So maybe that's a good thing to do if you do generate this report and you notice that the total estimated cost isn't looking that crash hot. You can always come down and have a look at your team members. That might explain why or why not that's the case if they haven't been assigned yet. Now looking at how a job's tracking, these are quite self-explanatory. So what's been invoiced so far?
And that includes all the draft invoices, awaiting payment invoices, and paid.
And I think in this instance, what I can see already is that budget, knowing that was generated from a quote, especially, the invoiced amount here, that looks like a 50% amount of this budget. So I know that I've probably done an upfront payment, which I've received, which is why this profit margin has already been generated, despite not having invoiced the full amount yet. So there is still a bit to go, and that profit margin is still likely to shift. I can kind of gauge where this project is still in progress. It's not quite done yet.
Total used cost is pretty self-explanatory as well. It's all the used time and expenses based on cost rates and expense cost rates. Total used sell, on the other hand, is the same. All the used time and expenses based on the sell rates.
That profit margin, is the invoiced amount minus the total used cost of the project. So it's the difference between the entire amount that the client's going to be paying you and what you have paid for this job. So it's essentially the amount that you'll take home at the end of the day and can put towards fun things like
I don't know.
team lunches, dinners,
Merch.
that profit margin versus the budget. That one is, again, we can see that as a part of our profit margin comparison on the right-hand side there. It is the budget, so that initial quoted amount, minus the total used cost at the time of the report generation. So right now, we're halfway through this project, and that's why that figure looks so healthy, because we haven't used all of the time that was initially budgeted for yet. We haven't, we've probably only used about half of it, which is why that figure looks so good. And essentially that's telling us what the profit margin would be if the budget were to be invoiced right now. So if we actually had finished all of our work and wanted to invoice this project, despite not having actually used half of what we'd budgeted, which could happen, that's great, then we could generate that invoice or that in budgeted amount as an invoice, and have this job reconciled with a really nice profit margin.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you want to sum up this? Just tell us what's going on in this little box down here, Holly?
Yeah. So it's just a quick insights, how your job is tracking. So quick insights on how much of the estimated costs has been used, and planned hours, for example. Right now, we are telling you that this job has used 51% of the estimated cost and 41% of planned hours. So you can, at a glance, see actually what's going on, and just a very quick insight on the job progress itself.
Exactly.
I love those insights. I love the percentage, really.
Yeah, it's a nice little statistic that we kind of pull up. And again, that way of presenting that data isn't necessarily done in other parts of Streamtime. It's just there. So it is useful as well to give you a little snapshot in terms of where is the job currently at.
Yeah.
That 41% of the planned hours is really useful. If you are looking at that profit margin figure, or why the profit margin and the profit margin versus the budget is so different, knowing that it's only because you're only 41% through the project itself, is a great way to just, understand, okay, well, we've got a while to go. Let's not take these figures for gospel yet, but we like where we're at right now.
Yeah, it's the clarity of this little message is really good. That's all you need to know when it comes to looking at the job and at a glance, quick glance, and not even focusing too much on the actual numbers. You've got the percentage there, so just opens your mind on how the job's tracking at this time.
Exactly, yeah. And on the right-hand side there, we don't need to go into these figures again. We've just talked about what they are and how they're calculated, but we just compare a few of those different cells or those different numbers against each other. And, they're presented in that bar graph style, so you can kind of see how they stack up against each other. So the total used cost versus the total the total estimated cost, and showing us the budget there too. The profit margin comparison shows us the profit margin versus the budget, and the estimated profit margin. And again, that invoiced amount versus the budget shows us the invoiced amount, the total used cell, and that total budgeted amount too. So that budget will always act as a bit of a guide, and the two above it should kind of be stacking up towards that budget.
Yeah. And since we introduced some of the new terms into Streamtime, we made sure that you know what's going on at any time. So we added a little tooltip there on the bottom right corner, where you can always have a look at, see how we calculate those estimated profit margin, and profit margin versus budget. I said way too many profit margins today. Yeah. So if you were to look back and understand where we get that information from, just have a look. And if you have questions, once you kind of generate those JCRs, you can always chat to us and clarify them online.
Cool. Let's scroll through. The next few pages probably don't need as much explanation as that first one does. Essentially, what we then present to you on the following pages is a summary of all the different components of the job. And this is pretty self-explanatory. We use pretty much all the information that we've just seen now. But we show you the breakdown of all quotes on the jobs, any invoices, your items and expenses. And so within these, we can see when these quotes might have been issued, the total amount on them, any tax included, and its status.
Yeah.
Similarly, on invoices, we're looking at the issue date, its due date, the total amount invoiced, the amount paid so far, when that might have happened, and that status too.
Exactly. And as we said at the very beginning, we won't include the items with no team members or time planned in here because that number, that calculation doesn't go into the JCR unless you add a team member into an item and the planned time.
Cool. And so within these items, we can see we do bring in the cost rate of the team members against those items assigned, which might help you understand exactly why you're seeing those estimated profit margins or estimated cost rates, and maybe just remind you exactly of what those figures are, which can be really useful.
For sure.
So we can see that estimated cost then surfaced there too. And then we're looking at the used time on the project so far, the estimated profit margin of the entire project versus the current profit margin as well. So what had we, budgeted for, planned for, and what's it currently sitting at?
Yeah, it's awesome.
Cool.
And since we are looking at lots of costs to the business, I just wanted to say cost to the business, individual cost rates, only people who have access to cost rates in Streamtime will be able to see and generate JCR.
Yeah. Cool, nice one. And the last page here, we are seeing our expenses. So expenses and purchase orders will be broken into two parts on this project. There's only one expense. We can see the name of that when it was added, a reference if we have got one in there. So that could be a purchase or a supplier invoice number, whatever you want it to be, really. It's a free field. That's a common use for it, though. We do then have the cost, the sell, and what that estimated profit margin will be, given that that is what we invoice at the end of the project. And you see similar information there for the purchase orders when they're included. So that's really it, and we've made good time. We brought that one home quickly in the end. It's 10:57. There's one question there from Richard. Polly, do you want to have a look at that?
Yeah, sure. So a question for the end. Is there a way to run a top line report that covers the JCR on multiple live jobs, perhaps at the end of the month for reporting?
So, Richard, my response to that would be, I know, as we said before, the JCR exists on a project-by-project basis.
Yeah.
Depending exactly what it is that you're wanting to see in that report, I would suggest that it might be handled within the jobs list. Perhaps that's just a combination of different columns and filters that you've got set up, looking at what those projects are together. So whilst we might not generate that into a report like this for you, depending on what you're actually wanting to see, a lot of the information that we present in here is actually visible in that jobs list when you turn on the right columns. So I wonder if it's going to be a matter of just setting up the right report. And if you do want to take a look at that later, just let us know and we can set up a time to jump on the phone and look at setting that one up with you.
Good answer, buddy. Thank you.
No worries.
That's it. I think it's been half an hour.
10:58, 28 minutes.
So if you guys have no more questions, I feel like it's a good sign. It means we've covered everything. If you have questions after the webinar, just feel free to chat to us straight away from Streamtime. Thank you, Lou. We are always happy to help.
Of course. Thanks everyone for tuning in. See you next week.